Spain, 1503. Part 1. The Path of Uncertainty. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape as Diego walked with a group of pilgrims towards Santiago de Compostela. Each step was a rhythm, the dust beneath his feet rising and swirling in the gentle breeze. He was young, no older than 20, but the lines of hardship already etched his face with a wisdom far beyond his years. His journey wasn't just a pilgrimage of faith, it was a desperate search for peace. The air was thick with anticipation. Pilgrims from different corners of Spain and beyond spoke of miracles that had occurred at Santiago's shrine. Diego heard stories of the sick being healed, of the lost finding their way again. And yet, despite the excitement buzzing around him, there was a shadow that clung to his heart, one that he couldn't shake. He had been a boy when the plague had ravaged his village, leaving devastation in its wake. His mother, a devout woman with hands that always smelled of flower and herbs, had been the first to fall ill. Diego could still see her frail form, curled up in their small cottage, whispering prayers even as her strength faded. His father, once a strong and proud man, was next, his voice trembling as he led the family in their final evening prayers before succumbing to the sickness. Diego, miraculously untouched by the illness, had been left behind to bury them both, alone in the world at an age when boys were still meant to have their parents' guiding hands. It was this grief, this gnawing sorrow, that had driven Diego to join the pilgrimage. He hoped that by reaching the shrine, by walking these holy steps, he would find answers, an understanding, a connection to the God who had taken everything from him. But even as he walked, surrounded by pilgrims full of hope, he couldn't shake the sense of abandonment that had been festering in his soul. The road stretched endlessly ahead. Vast, towering forests lined the path on both sides, the trees whispering secrets with the rustle of their leaves. The air was cool under the shade of the canopy, but there was an odd heaviness about it, as though the forest watched them, waiting. Diego walked in silence, his eyes occasionally drifting to the pilgrims around him. There were men and women of all ages. Some limped on sore feet, leaning heavily on their staffs, while others walked with a lightness that came from their unwavering faith. A few murmured prayers under their breath, their lips moving in silent conversation with God. Diego wished he could feel that same connection, but his prayers felt empty, his words hollow. He clung to his faith, but it was like holding on to smoke, always slipping through his fingers. The journey was long, and though they had only just begun, Diego already felt the weight of fatigue creeping into his bones. His back ached from the weight of the small bundle he carried, just a thin cloak, a loaf of bread, and a water skin that was already half empty. He glanced at the sky, watching the sun as it inched toward the horizon. The thought of nightfall filled him with unease. The darkness had always held a kind of power over him, a reminder of the nights spent awake, listening to the labored breathing of his dying parents. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, the leader of the pilgrimage, a stout man named Father Alvaro, called for a rest. The group gathered by the side of the road, settling beneath the towering trees. Some pilgrims unpacked their meager rations, while others, like Diego, sat in silence, lost in thought. Diego's gaze drifted to the edge of the forest. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled, as though they had stood there since the beginning of time. A shiver ran down his spine as he stared into the dark depths between the trees. There was something unsettling about the forest, something ancient and unknowable. It reminded him of the stories his father used to tell, stories of spirits and lost souls who wandered the woods, never to be seen again. Shaking the thought from his mind, Diego rose to his feet, feeling the pull of the forest. He wasn't sure why, but something about the thick trees called to him. Maybe it was the need for solitude, or perhaps it was the desire to feel something. Anything that wasn't the constant ache of loss. "I'll be back soon," he muttered to the pilgrim sitting closest to him, a kind woman with weathered skin who had smiled at him earlier that day. She nodded absently, her attention focused on her rosary. Diego stepped into the forest, the cool shade enveloping him like a cloak. The air was different here, still and quiet, the sound of the group's chatter fading away behind him. His feet crunched softly over the undergrowth, and with each step, the sense of separation grew. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole, cutting him off from the world outside. He walked deeper, the trees towering above him, their branches entwined in a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The light that filtered through was dim and golden, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the wind. Diego's heartbeat quickened, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was curiosity. There was something peaceful about the isolation, a strange comfort in the silence that surrounded him. For a while, Diego simply walked, letting his thoughts wander as he moved through the dense woods. The sounds of the forest became his only companions. The rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was almost calming, lulling him into a false sense of security. But then, as he turned to head back toward the road, something shifted. He stopped looking around. The trees all looked the same, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches forming an impenetrable wall. Panic rose in his chest as he realized he had no idea where he was. The path back to the Pilgrims was gone, swallowed by the dense forest. He spun in a circle, his heart racing, but every direction looked the same. Endless trees, endless shadows. Diego's breath came in short gasps as the full weight of his situation hit him. He was lost. Part 2. In the grasp of desperation. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the forest draped in the cloak of dusk. The once warm and golden light had been replaced by an unsettling darkness, where shadows seemed to stretch impossibly long, creeping in like silent predators. The cold began to bite at Diego's skin as the wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down his spine. He walked in circles, trying to retrace his steps, but every effort only deepened his confusion. The forest was a labyrinth, and Diego was trapped at its center. He stopped once again, trying to calm his racing heart, but the forest had an eerie stillness to it now, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to falter. His breaths came in shallow gasps as panic started to take hold. He looked up at the sky, hoping for some guidance from the stars, but the thick canopy above blotted out everything, leaving him in near-total darkness. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches intertwining in a suffocating grip above him. "God, please," Diego muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. It was the first time since entering the forest that he allowed his desperation to fully surface, but the act of speaking aloud only intensified the silence around him. It felt as though even his words were swallowed by the trees, leaving him even more isolated. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, and for the first time in his life, his faith faltered. Where was the guiding hand of God? Where was the light he had always believed would lead him through his darkest hours? The weight of doubt pressed heavily on him as the reality of his situation became undeniable. He was lost in the middle of a forest, with no food, no water, and no idea how to escape. The forest seemed alive, but not in the way that offered comfort. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent Diego's heart pounding. He spun around, eyes wide, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. Was it a wild animal? Was something watching him from the shadows? His imagination ran wild, conjuring images of wolves or bandits hiding in the trees, waiting to strike when he was at his weakest. He shuddered, pulling his cloak tighter around him, though it did little to keep the cold fear at bay. His legs grew weak, his body trembling not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming weight of hopelessness that clung to him. His breaths were shallow, his mouth dry from the panic and the exertion of his futile wandering. The hunger gnawed at his stomach, and his throat burned with thirst, every swallow feeling like sandpaper. How long had it been since he'd last eaten? How long since he'd drunk anything? The bread and water he had carried had been left with the group, Now, he had nothing. The darkness was absolute now. The forest an endless expanse of black, broken only by the faintest slivers of moonlight that managed to slip through the canopy. Diego stumbled forward, the uneven ground beneath him making every step a challenge. Roots snaked across the earth, hidden in the shadows, and more than once, they caught his feet, sending him sprawling into the dirt. He fell hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. For a moment, he simply lay there, his face pressed against the cold earth, too exhausted to rise. The forest closed in around him, the trees towering over his small, crumpled form. The night seemed to stretch on, endless and unrelenting, as if time itself had forgotten him in this desolate place. His muscles ached, and the cold seeped into his bones. "Help me." His voice was weaker now, barely a whisper against the howling wind. He wasn't sure if he was talking to God or just the empty forest, but the words left his lips before he could stop them. "Please, someone, help me." But the silence was deafening. The realization hit him with the force of a hammer. No one was coming. The pilgrims were long gone by now, and even if they noticed he was missing, they wouldn't know where to look. He was utterly, hopelessly alone. The hunger worsened, gnawing at him with a sharp, relentless intensity. It wasn't just the absence of food that tormented him, but the knowledge that even if he found his way out, his body was weakening. Diego sat up slowly, resting his back against a tree, staring out into the void of the forest. His limbs felt heavy, and his vision blurred with exhaustion. He had always thought himself strong in faith, but here, in the dark heart of the forest, he found his resolve crumbling. What if God had abandoned him? What if this was his punishment for some unspoken sin, some fault he had never recognized? The thought twisted in his mind, feeding the fear already gnawing at his insides. His parents had died despite their prayers. He had begged for their lives, knelt beside their sickbeds, whispered desperate pleas to God, and they had still been taken from him. And now, here he was again, begging for help with nothing but silence in return. Diego's hands clenched into fists as a sob rose in his throat. It was too much. He had come on this pilgrimage seeking answers, seeking peace, but all he had found was despair. He lowered his head, burying his face in his hands, tears spilling down his cheeks as the enormity of his situation crashed over him. His shoulders shook with the force of his sobs, and he no longer had the strength to stop them. Hours seemed to pass in this state of hopelessness. The weight of exhaustion was pulling him deeper into despair, but something within him refused to give up completely. In the quiet between sobs, a voice whispered from the depths of his soul. Not an audible voice, but something deeper, a whisper of the faith he had once held so dearly. "Pray," it seemed to say. "Pray, even now." Diego hesitated, his lips trembling. Could he pray? Did he still believe? The doubt clawed at him. But somewhere beneath the layers of fear and hopelessness, there was still a flicker of faith, faint but persistent. With shaking hands, Diego pressed his palms together, his fingers trembling as he lifted his head. His eyes, still blurred with tears, stared up into the darkness of the forest canopy. His voice was raw, broken. As he began to speak, the words falling from his lips like a plea. "God, if you are still with me, if you can hear me, I need you now," he whispered. "I have nothing left. I'm lost, and I can't find my way out. Please guide me. Lead me back to the path. Don't leave me here." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a long time, there was no response, no sign, no miracle. Just the wind in the trees and the distant cry of a night bird. Diego sat there, waiting, his heart heavy with both hope and despair. And then, just as he was about to give in to the cold embrace of exhaustion, something caught his eye. A flicker of light, small, distant, but unmistakable, appeared between the trees. His breath caught in his throat as he blinked, wondering if it was a trick of his tired mind. But no, it was real. The light shimmered, steady and bright, piercing through the darkness of the forest. His heart pounded as he struggled to his feet, his body trembling with both weakness and newfound hope. The light was faint, but it was there, a beacon in the distance. Diego didn't know what it was or where it would lead, but it was something to hold on to. With unsteady steps, he began to move toward it, the light pulling him forward like a moth drawn to a flame. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. All that mattered now was reaching that light, that glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time since he had entered the forest, Diego felt a flicker of hope. Part 3. The Light of Redemption. Diego's heart pounded as he pushed through the last few feet of dense foliage, each step feeling like a test of his remaining strength. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he could not stop. His eyes remained locked on the light ahead, steady, unwavering, and pulling him forward with a force he couldn't explain. It wasn't a mere flicker of a torch or the soft glow of a distant fire. It was something far more profound, more sacred. The light pierced the suffocating darkness of the forest like a beacon, guiding him when all seemed lost. As Diego emerged from the thicket, the source of the glow came into view, and the sight before him stole what little breath he had left. In the heart of the forest stood a small chapel, hidden deep within the wilderness, its ancient stone walls bathed in an ethereal golden light. The building was simple, almost humble, yet there was something majestic about it. Its very presence seemed to pulse with divine energy, a power that was at once overwhelming and peaceful. The chapel appeared as though it had stood there for centuries, untouched by time, its weathered stones covered in moss and ivy. The arched windows were small, but they allowed the soft glow of candlelight to spill out into the forest, illuminating the surrounding trees and casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. The warm light felt like a lifeline, a whisper of hope in the vast, silent darkness that had threatened to consume him. Diego stood frozen, unable to move, his body trembling not just from exhaustion, but from the awe that gripped him. This was no ordinary building. It was a sanctuary, a refuge, perhaps the very one he had prayed for. In that moment, all the fear, the doubt, the anguish he had endured began to melt away. He had not been abandoned after all. He had been led here, to this place, by something far greater than he could comprehend. His legs shook beneath him, and he stumbled forward, desperate to reach the doors of the chapel. His body was weak, each step a monumental effort, but the hope of salvation was too strong to resist. The wooden doors, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon him closer, their worn surfaces gleaming faintly in the golden light. As Diego reached out and pushed the door open, the cool air of the forest was replaced by a wave of warmth. The chapel's interior was bathed in the same soft light, but it was even more profound inside. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of holiness, as though every stone, every corner of the room had been blessed. The air smelled faintly of incense, the fragrance filling his lungs and calming his racing heart. The interior was small but beautiful. Rows of simple wooden pews lined the chapel, facing a modest altar at the front, which was adorned with fresh flowers and a single golden cross. Flickering candles were placed along the walls, their flames steady and bright, casting a soft glow over the stone floor. The walls themselves were bare except for a few small, intricately carved statues of saints, their expressions serene, watching over the space with an air of quiet reverence. But it wasn't just the chapel's beauty that overwhelmed Diego. It was the presence he felt there. It was as if the very air hummed with the divine, a silent, constant prayer that permeated everything. He felt it deep within his soul, a connection to something much greater than himself. Tears welled in his eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. He had never felt anything like this before, not even in the grand cathedrals he had visited in the cities. This place, hidden and unassuming, held a power far beyond the physical world. Kneeling before the altar were several monks, their heads bowed in silent prayer. They wore simple brown robes, their faces obscured by the hoods they had pulled over their heads. Diego watched them, mesmerized by the tranquility that surrounded them. Their stillness was a stark contrast to the chaos and terror he had felt only hours before, lost and afraid in the forest. One of the monks, sensing Diego's presence, slowly rose from his place of prayer and turned toward him. The monk was an older man, his face deeply lined with age, but softened by a gentle smile. His eyes, though tired, gleamed with kindness and understanding, as though he had seen many pilgrims like Diego before. "Welcome, traveler," the monk said softly, his voice rich and calming, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. "You have found your way here, as many have before you. Be at peace." Diego's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor, overcome with emotion. The weight of everything he had endured, the fear, the despair, the doubt, finally broke through the walls he had built around himself. Tears streamed down his face as he knelt before the monk, his hands trembling as he clutched at his chest. He had thought himself strong, but here, in this holy place, he realized just how vulnerable he had become. "I was lost," Diego choked, his voice barely above a whisper. I prayed for help, but I thought no one would hear me." The monk knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on Diego's shoulder. "God hears all who call to him, especially in their moments of greatest need. You were never alone, my son. He guided you here, to this place, so that you may find peace." Diego's heart swelled with gratitude. He had been so consumed by fear and doubt, so lost in his own pain, that he had forgotten the simple truth he had been taught all his life. God was always with him, even in the darkest of times. The realization hit him with the force of a flood, washing away the last remnants of his despair. The monk helped Diego to his feet and led him to a small table at the side of the chapel, where a simple meal of bread and water had been prepared. Diego hadn't realized just how hungry he was until the scent of the fresh bread reached his nose. His stomach growled in response, and he gratefully accepted the meal, eating slowly as the monk sat beside him. As Diego ate, the monk spoke quietly, sharing the story of the chapel. It had been built centuries ago by a small order of monks who had chosen to live in isolation, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. Over time, the chapel had become a sanctuary for lost pilgrims, those who, like Diego, had strayed from the path or found themselves wandering in the wilderness. The light that Diego had followed was no ordinary light. It was the divine, a manifestation of God's will, meant to guide those in need. Diego listened in awe, his heart filling with wonder. He had heard of miracles before, but he had never imagined that he would be part of one. This place, this moment, was a gift, an answer to the prayers he had whispered in the dark. And though he couldn't fully understand the reasons behind it, he knew that he had been saved for a purpose. After the meal, the monk invited Diego to join him and the other monks in prayer. Diego, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened, hesitated for a moment. He had always prayed out of duty, out of habit, but this felt different. There was a sincerity to the way the monks prayed, a deep and abiding faith that resonated with him. It wasn't about ritual or obligation. It was about connection, about speaking directly to God. Diego knelt at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The candles flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the chapel, and the monks' voices filled the space with a soft, rhythmic chant. Diego closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and for the first time in his life, he prayed with his whole heart. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for guiding me here. I was lost, but now I see. I see that you have always been with me." As he spoke the words, a deep sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a temporary reprieve from danger. It was something much deeper, much more profound. It was the peace that came from knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was loved, that he was seen, that he was heard. The monks continued their prayers, their voices rising and falling in a soothing melody, and Diego let himself be carried by the rhythm of their devotion. Time seemed to blur, and he felt as though he were suspended in a place between the physical and the divine, where the worries of the world no longer had any power over him. He stayed there, kneeling in prayer, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the chapel's small windows. The golden rays of the morning sun mingled with the candlelight, creating a soft glow that bathed the entire room in warmth. Diego opened his eyes and smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had found his way again. Part 4. A Soul Restored. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows, a warm, golden glow illuminated the chapel. The soft, colored light danced across the stone walls, casting vivid hues of red, blue, and gold that shimmered like fragments of a dream. The cold, suffocating darkness that had once clung to Diego's heart was now a distant memory. He had spent the entire night in prayer, enveloped in the comforting presence of the monks and the divine warmth that filled the chapel. Every breath he took felt lighter, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his chest. The early morning light brought with it a sense of renewal, of rebirth. Diego had not slept, but he felt no exhaustion, no weariness. Instead, he was filled with a quiet strength, a resolve that he had never known before. For the first time in years, he was free of the gnawing despair that had haunted him since his family's death. In this holy place, he had found peace, not just a fleeting sense of comfort, but a deep, abiding peace that settled into his very soul. The monks, too, seemed rejuvenated by the dawn. They moved quietly about the chapel, lighting new candles, arranging the flowers on the altar, and preparing for the day's prayers. Their movements were unhurried, graceful, as if they were part of a sacred dance that had been performed for centuries. Diego watched them in awe, marveling at their devotion and the serenity that radiated from each of them. They seemed to live in perfect harmony with the divine, their every action a testament to their unwavering faith. Diego rose slowly from where he had been kneeling, his legs stiff but his heart light. As he stood, one of the monks approached him, the same elderly man who had welcomed him the night before. The monk's face was lined with age, but his eyes were bright, filled with a kindness that seemed to flow from the very core of his being. "Did you find what you were seeking, my son?" the monk asked, his voice soft but full of wisdom. Diego nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. I think I did," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how lost I was until I found this place. I came here on a pilgrimage, hoping to find something, but I didn't know what it was. Now, I feel like I've been given a second chance." The monk smiled, a knowing smile that spoke of many such encounters. God's grace is often found in the places we least expect. This chapel has stood here for centuries, a beacon for those who have lost their way. You were guided here, not by accident, but by divine will. You were meant to find this place, just as it was meant to find you. Diego felt a lump form in his throat as he considered the monk's words. He had spent so long feeling abandoned, so long questioning why God had taken his family, why he had allowed such pain into his life. But now, in the soft light of morning, Diego realized that God had never abandoned him. He had been there all along, waiting for the moment when Diego was ready to return to him. The monk gestured toward the altar, where the candles flickered softly in the morning light. "Take a moment, my son. Reflect on what you have learned here, and when you are ready, you will know what to do next." Diego nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He walked slowly toward the altar, each step feeling deliberate, purposeful. The golden cross gleamed in the light, a symbol of the faith that had once seemed so distant, but now felt closer than ever before. Diego knelt before the altar, bowing his head in prayer, but this time, his prayer was not one of desperation. It was a prayer of thanks, a prayer of devotion. As Diego prayed, the memories of his journey flooded back to him. The moments of fear, the moments of doubt. He had been so close to giving up, so close to surrendering to the darkness that had surrounded him. But in his darkest hour, he had called out to God, and God had answered. The light that had guided him to the chapel was not just a physical light. It was a symbol of the hope that had been rekindled in his heart. The longer Diego knelt in prayer, the more his thoughts turned to the future. He had come on this pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela with the hope of finding healing, but he now realized that the true healing had already begun. His journey was not yet over, but he no longer felt the crushing weight of uncertainty. His steps would be lighter, his faith renewed, and his purpose clear. As he rose from his knees, Diego felt a profound sense of clarity. The fog of doubt that had clouded his mind for so long had lifted, and in its place was a quiet, steady confidence. He had been given a gift, a chance to start anew, and he would not waste it. The monks had gathered near the entrance of the chapel, their voices low as they prepared to resume their morning prayers. Diego approached them, his heart full of gratitude for their kindness, for the sanctuary they had provided. The elderly monk who had spoken to him earlier stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with warmth. "You are ready," the monk said, his voice gentle but firm. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the certainty of one who understood the journey Diego had undergone. "I am," Diego replied, his voice steady. "Thank you for everything. I will never forget what I found here." The monk smiled and placed a hand on Diego's shoulder. "Go with God, my son. And remember, the light that guided you here will always be with you, no matter where your path takes you." With a final nod of gratitude, Diego stepped outside the chapel. The forest that had once felt so menacing now seemed peaceful, bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. The trees, which had loomed so tall and threatening the night before, now stood like silent sentinels, their leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. Diego took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, fresh air. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years, as if every part of him had been renewed. The path that stretched before him, the one that would lead him back to the pilgrimage route, seemed clearer than ever before. He wasn't just physically rejoining the journey. He was stepping back into the world with a heart full of purpose. As he began to walk, Diego reflected on the miracle he had experienced. He had come to the edge of despair, and yet, in that moment of darkness, God had shown him the way. The chapel had been a beacon, a refuge, but it had also been a reminder. It reminded him that faith was not just about the moments when things were easy, when the path was clear. Faith was about the moments of struggle, the moments of doubt. It was about trusting in something greater than oneself, even when the way forward seemed impossible. Diego's steps quickened as he found his stride. His heart was light, his spirit lifted, and his mind at peace. He knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt. But he was no longer afraid. He had faced the darkness and found the light. As the forest thinned and the familiar path of the pilgrimage route came into view, Diego felt a surge of joy. He had been lost, but now he was found. And though his journey to Santiago de Compostela was far from over, he knew that he would walk it with a heart full of faith, a soul restored by the grace of God. And in the quiet morning air, as the sun continued to rise, Diego whispered a final prayer, a prayer of gratitude, of hope, and of unwavering faith. Part 5. Faith rekindled, a pilgrim renewed. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a soft, golden light over the forest. Diego's feet moved steadily along the path, each step carrying him closer to the pilgrimage route. The once imposing trees no longer seemed menacing. Instead, they stood tall and proud, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as if bidding him farewell. The weight of the forest, the confusion, and the fear that had once clouded his mind had dissolved, leaving only a sense of purpose. Diego was no longer just a traveler wandering aimlessly. He was a man of faith, renewed and guided by the light that had led him through his darkest moments. Every step felt like a prayer, a communion with the divine. The air was fresh and clean, filling his lungs with each breath, as though the very atmosphere around him was part of the miracle he had experienced. The weight of exhaustion that had clung to his body, the hunger that had gnawed at him, had faded into the background. His body was still tired, but it was a different kind of weariness now, a peaceful exhaustion, the kind that comes after a battle won, after a soul has been tested and emerged victorious. As Diego walked, his thoughts turned back to the chapel, to the monks, and to the miraculous light that had guided him there. He could still feel the warmth of that divine presence deep in his chest, a soft but steady flame that seemed to burn brighter with every passing moment. It was more than just a memory. It was something that had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his soul. The doubts that had plagued him for so long, the questions that had tormented him, had all been silenced by the undeniable reality of what he had experienced. God had not only heard him, he had answered in a way that Diego could never have anticipated. The path before him was familiar now, the dense woods beginning to thin as the open road to Santiago de Compostela came into view. Diego's heart swelled with gratitude as he stepped out of the forest and into the clearing. The vast landscape stretched out before him, rolling hills and fields bathed in the light of the early morning sun. The road, long and winding, beckoned him forward, and for the first time in days, Diego felt a deep sense of anticipation, not just for the destination, but for the journey itself. He paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the world around him. The birds sang sweetly in the trees, their songs filling the air with a melody that seemed to reflect the peace he felt inside. The soft rustle of the wind through the grass, the distant murmur of a stream. It was all a part of the symphony of creation, a reminder of the divine presence that infused every corner of the earth. Diego smiled, his heart full of gratitude. As he continued walking, Diego thought of his family, his mother, his father, and the grief that had weighed him down for so long. He had come on this pilgrimage in the hope of finding solace, of making peace with their passing. And now, he realized that he had found more than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about closure or healing, it was about understanding. His family had been taken from him, yes, but they had not been lost. Their spirits lived on, just as his faith now burned brighter than ever before. Diego touched the small wooden cross that hung around his neck, a gift from the elderly monk who had prayed with him in the chapel. The monk's words echoed in his mind, a reminder that the light that had guided him through the forest would always be with him, no matter where his journey led. It wasn't just the physical light of the candles or the warmth of the chapel. It was the light of faith, the unwavering belief that God's presence was always near, even in the darkest of places. As the road stretched out before him, Diego noticed something in the distance, a small group of pilgrims walking steadily toward Santiago. His heart leaped with recognition. It was his group, the same people he had become separated from in the forest. They hadn't left him behind after all. They had continued on, trusting that he would find his way back. Diego quickened his pace, a smile spreading across his face as he drew nearer to them. When they saw him approach, the group turned in surprise, their faces lighting up with joy. One of the older men, a weathered traveler named Luis who had walked beside Diego for much of the journey, stepped forward with a wide grin. "Diego, we thought we had lost you in the woods. Praise be to God that you've found your way back to us," Luis said, his voice filled with genuine relief. Diego smiled, clasping Luis's hand in a firm grip. "I was lost," he admitted, his voice steady, "but God led me to a place I never would have found on my own. There was a chapel deep in the forest, and the monks there took me in. They showed me that even when we feel lost, we are never truly alone." The other pilgrims gathered around him, listening intently as Diego recounted his miraculous experience. There was awe in their eyes as they heard his story, a reminder of the divine power that had guided them all on this journey. Some of the women wiped tears from their eyes, while the men bowed their heads in silent prayer, offering thanks for Diego's safe return. As the group resumed their walk together, the mood was different now, lighter, more filled with hope. Diego's story had touched them all, reminding them of the power of faith, the strength that came from trusting in God's guidance. The road ahead was still long, and the journey to Santiago would be challenging. But now, they walked with a renewed sense of purpose. Diego walked at the front of the group, his steps steady and sure. The landscape unfolded before them, each hill and valley a testament to the beauty of creation. And as they walked, Diego found himself filled with a sense of quiet joy, a deep and abiding peace that he hadn't known in years. The darkness that had once clouded his heart had been replaced by light, and he knew, without a doubt, that his path was guided by something far greater than himself. The pilgrimage to Santiago was no longer just a physical journey. It had become a spiritual one, a testament to the power of faith and the resilience of the human soul. Diego had come face to face with his deepest fears, his darkest doubts, and yet he had emerged from the forest stronger, his faith unshakable. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the road, Diego whispered a prayer of gratitude, his heart swelling with devotion. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never walk this path alone again. God was with him, now and always, a guiding light in the darkness, a beacon of hope on the road ahead. The days stretched on, and with each step, Diego felt the presence of the divine more deeply. His body might tire, his feet might ache, but his spirit was strong, carried by the grace of God. The road to Santiago lay ahead, and Diego walked it with a heart full of faith, a soul renewed by the light that had found him when he was lost. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the group made their way across the open plains, the distant spires of Santiago still far on the horizon. But Diego didn't rush, didn't push himself to move faster. He knew, now more than ever, that the destination was important, but the journey, the steps of faith he took each day, were just as vital. And so, Diego walked on, his eyes lifted to the heavens, his heart filled with an unshakable belief that no matter where his path led, God's light would always guide him home. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.